It's August 15th, 2026. Welcome back, everybody. Yesterday, standing in front of a crowd of law enforcement officers in Nassau County, New York, the President of the United States said something that no American leader has ever said about a foreign waterway in modern history. He said the United States is going to declare the Strait of Hormuz a territory of the United States. Not an ally, not a protectorate, not a security zone, a territory. And, before the sun even came up in Tehran, Iran's own deputy foreign minister fired back with a line that is already being repeated across the region. The Strait of Hormuz cannot be seized by tweet, by aircraft carrier, by executive order, or by a campaign speech. So today we're breaking down exactly what was said, why it matters, what it actually means in terms of international law, and what's really happening beneath the surface of this waterway that carries roughly a fifth of the entire planet's oil supply every single day. Stick around, because by the end of this video, you're going to understand this crisis better than most of the anchors currently talking about it on cable news. Here's everything we're covering today. First, we're breaking down the actual statement from the president, word for word, what he said about defeating Iran, what he said about the blockade being a wall of steel, and why he chose a police academy audience in New York to make one of the biggest geopolitical claims of the year. Then we're going to dig into Iran's response, because Tehran did not stay quiet. And the language coming out of their foreign ministry right now is about as sharp as it's been in months. After that, we're rewinding the tape all the way back to February, because you cannot understand what's happening this week without understanding how we got here, from the opening strikes to the collapsed memorandum of understanding to the blockade being reinstated in July. Then we're heading into the roundup section, where we'll cover the crisis unfolding aboard one of America's own aircraft carriers, the oil price whiplash hitting the global economy, and a few other developments most people are sleeping on. And finally, we close out with a strategic analysis, because when you actually sit down and think through what declaring a choke point like Hormuz as sovereign American territory would require, legally, militarily, and diplomatically, the whole thing gets a lot more complicated than a rally line. Let's get into it. So let's start with exactly what was said, because the wording matters here more than people realize. The president was in Garden City, New York, campaigning for a Republican gubernatorial candidate, and in the middle of a speech that was mostly about crime and the economy, he pivoted straight into the Iran war. Here's the quote: "After we finish defeating Iran, which is being very badly defeated, pretty soon I'll be declaring the Hormuz Strait a territory of the United States." The crowd erupted. Law enforcement professionals in that room cheered like it was a football game. And he didn't stop there. He went on to say that the United States has total control over the Strait of Hormuz right now, that he thinks the country will just keep it, and that the naval blockade currently choking off Iranian ports is being called by everyone, in his words, a wall of steel. "No ships get through unless we want them to," he said. "Our military is unbelievable. The blockade is unstoppable." That was the exact phrase. A wall of steel. And listen, that phrase is not just rally theater. There are more than 20 American warships currently stationed along that blockade line, destroyers, submarines, carrier strike groups, all of it working together with satellite coverage and airborne radar to track literally every vessel that tries to move through that stretch of water. So when he says wall of steel, there is actual hardware behind that sentence. But here's where it gets interesting, because in the same breath, he also asked the American public to accept paying more at the pump because of this war, framing higher gas prices as the cost of keeping Iran away from a nuclear weapon. So on one hand, you've got total dominance rhetoric, and on the other hand, you've got an admission that ordinary Americans are footing an economic bill for this standoff. Both of those things are true at the same time, and that tension is going to run through this entire story. And it's worth sitting with just how unusual this rally setting actually was for a statement of this magnitude. This wasn't a national address from the Oval Office. This wasn't a formal briefing at the Pentagon with generals standing behind a podium. This was a campaign stop for a local gubernatorial race in front of an audience of police officers, tucked in the middle of a speech that was mostly about crime rates and grocery prices. And that detail matters more than people give it credit for, because it tells you something about how this administration has chosen to communicate major foreign policy positions throughout this entire war. Big claims land first as applause lines at rallies, and only later, if ever, do they get formalized into anything resembling official policy. We've seen this pattern before with other statements about Iran throughout this conflict. Bold declarations first, official clarification days or weeks later if it comes at all. So when you hear a claim like declaring an international strait as sovereign American territory, the responsible way to process that is not to take it as an announced policy shift, but as a signal of intent and a pressure tactic, which is a very different thing, and we'll unpack exactly why that distinction matters later in this video. Now let's talk about how Iran responded, because Tehran did not sit on this for even 24 hours. Iran's deputy foreign minister for legal and international affairs, a man named Kazem Garibabadi, posted almost immediately on social media. And his statement is worth reading in full because it tells you exactly how Iran is trying to frame this entire war right now. He said the Strait of Hormuz cannot be seized by tweet, nor by aircraft carrier, nor by issuing an order, nor by an election speech. He said Iran neither fears threats nor cowers before displays of power. And then he went further, saying that the United States needs to accept the reality that it has suffered what he called strategic and heavy defeats, and that the strait has been Iranian, is Iranian, and will remain Iranian, and that it will only be closed and opened under Iran's command. He closed by saying that as long as Washington refuses to accept the reality of defeat, Iran will continue enforcing the blockade. Now think about the framing here for a second, because this is actually a masterclass in information warfare from Tehran's side. Iran is taking a narrative where their own economy is being strangled, where their airplanes have reportedly been shot down by the dozens, where their coastal radar sites have been hammered wave after wave by American strike packages, and they are flipping that entire narrative into a story of defiance and victory. They are essentially saying, you can send all the carriers you want, you can make all the speeches you want, but this is our water, and it stays our water. And here's the thing, from a purely legal standpoint, Iran actually has a real argument to lean on. And we're going to get into exactly why in the strategic analysis section, because it's more complicated than either side wants to admit publicly. Let's rewind now and lay out the full timeline, because a lot of viewers are jumping into this story mid-conflict without understanding just how long this has been building. This war did not start last week. It started on February 28th of this year, when the United States and Israel launched a coordinated set of airstrikes against Iranian military targets. That opening wave was massive. It included the assassination of Iran's supreme leader at the time, a strike that immediately reshaped the entire power structure inside the Islamic Republic. From that moment forward, Iran considered itself at war, and one of its very first moves was to effectively shut the Strait of Hormuz to international shipping, using naval mines, boarding operations, and direct attacks on merchant vessels to make the message clear. Nobody transits this waterway without paying a price. The United States responded by imposing its own naval blockade on Iranian ports from mid-April through the end of May, an operation that at one point was paused temporarily while diplomats tried to hammer out a ceasefire framework. That framework actually succeeded for a while. In June, the two sides signed a memorandum of understanding, a real, on-paper agreement that was supposed to pause the fighting and establish some kind of stable arrangement for shipping through the strait. For a few weeks, things looked like they might actually settle down. But that memorandum collapsed last month over a dispute about exactly how traffic through Hormuz would be managed, with both sides accusing each other of violating the terms. Iran's interpretation of safe passage, as it turns out, meant that ships had to coordinate directly with Tehran before transiting, essentially giving the Iranian government veto power over roughly a fifth of the world's oil supply. When ships didn't comply with that system, some of them were struck by drones, and in at least one documented case, a mariner aboard a targeted vessel was killed. So, when the memorandum fell apart, the United States reinstated the blockade on Iranian ports in July, and that is the blockade the president is now calling a wall of steel. Since this crisis began back in late February, the human and material cost has been staggering. At least one tugboat has been sunk. More than 17 merchant ships have been damaged, with several of those abandoned entirely by their crews. 2 merchant ships have been captured outright. 12 seafarers have been killed or gone missing. A port worker was killed and 2 others wounded in an incident in Bahrain. And Iran itself has reportedly killed as many as 17 mariners in total across the various strikes on shipping since the crisis began. This is not an abstract geopolitical chess match. Real people, mostly civilian merchant crews who have absolutely nothing to do with the politics of Washington or Tehran, are the ones paying with their lives while both governments posture in front of cameras. Let's talk numbers for a second, because the scale of disruption here is honestly hard to overstate. Before this war began, the Strait of Hormuz carried about 25% of the entire world's seaborne oil trade and roughly 20% of global liquefied natural gas. That is not a regional choke point. That is a global one. Since the closure began, traffic through the strait has collapsed. And even when there have been brief windows of calm, transit numbers barely creep back up before another incident sends everyone scrambling for the exits again. In the most recent reporting period, preliminary data showed transits climbing to around 84 ships over a single week, nearly double the previous week's total of 45. But that uptick came right before a violent stretch where multiple ships attempting to use an alternate route near Oman were struck. So you get these little pockets of false hope where traffic starts to recover and then it gets slammed right back down. On the American side of the ledger, Central Command says it has redirected 45 merchant ships as part of enforcing its own blockade on the Iranian side, disabled 2 vessels, and boarded 2 more. Meanwhile, the oil terminal complex at Karg Island, which handles somewhere around 90% of Iran's entire export revenue through just 3 loading berths, has reportedly had those berths sitting empty for stretches of 10 to 22 days at a time. Think about what that actually means for a national economy. When your primary source of foreign currency income sits idle for weeks at a stretch, that is not sustainable, and it is a huge part of why the Iranian government's public rhetoric has gotten louder and more defiant, even as its actual economic position keeps getting weaker. Desperation dressed up as defiance is still desperation. And there's a deeper irony sitting underneath these numbers that's worth pointing out. Iran spent decades building up its position in the Strait of Hormuz as leverage, the idea being that because so much of the world's energy supply depends on that choke point staying open, no outside power would ever risk a full-scale confrontation over it. That was the entire logic behind the strategy, mutual economic dependence as a shield. But this war has essentially tested that theory to destruction. It turns out that when a government decides the political and military stakes are high enough, it will absorb the economic pain of disrupted oil markets rather than back down. And both Washington and Tehran have now proven willing to do exactly that for going on 6 months. The choke point that was supposed to be untouchable because everyone needed it has instead become the central battlefield precisely because everyone needs it. That is the paradox sitting at the heart of this entire conflict. And it's part of why analysts who study maritime choke points for a living have been watching this specific war more closely than almost anything else happening globally right now, because the old assumptions about what nations will and won't risk overshared waterways are being rewritten in real time. Now, before we go further into the roundup and the strategic breakdown, if this kind of deep dive into what's actually happening behind the headlines is useful to you, do me a favor and hit that like button. Drop a comment with what you think happens next. And if you're new here, go ahead and subscribe because we're covering this conflict as it develops in real time, and you do not want to miss the next update. All right, let's keep going. One of the stories running parallel to all of this, and one that deserves way more attention than it's getting, is what's happening aboard the USS Abraham Lincoln. This aircraft carrier left its home port in San Diego back in November, originally intended for deployment in the Pacific. It got rerouted to the Middle East once the war with Iran kicked off, and it has now been at sea for more than 250 consecutive days, making it the longest continuous deployment in modern Navy history without a real port stop. Roughly 5,000 sailors and Marines are packed onto that ship, and reports over the last several weeks have painted a genuinely troubling picture. Families of the crew have described conditions on board as hellish, citing food shortages, contaminated water, sewage flooding into inner corridors, mold, broken air conditioning, and a mental health crisis, serious enough that multiple sailors have reportedly attempted to go overboard. Military spouses have told reporters their husbands said things like they hope they don't wake up tomorrow. Senators from both parties have started demanding answers, with one lawmaker sending a formal letter to the Secretary of Defense, laying out concerns about widespread supply shortages, plumbing failures, and deteriorating psychological conditions among the crew. The Pentagon's official response has largely been to push back hard on this reporting, with officials saying they have not observed any increase in suicidal ideation aboard the ship, and pointing out that the vessel has 5 chaplains, a clinical psychologist, a clinical social worker, and several behavioral health technicians on board. But even with that pushback, the Navy has now confirmed additional mental health support is being sent to the ship, and the acting Secretary of the Navy has said the Lincoln will be heading home following this extended deployment. So here's the strategic point buried inside a human tragedy. You cannot maintain a wall of steel blockade indefinitely without paying a real cost. And that cost is not just measured in dollars. It is measured in the well-being of the actual human beings, enforcing that blockade thousands of miles from home for the better part of a year. Whatever side of this conflict you land on politically, that is worth sitting with for a second. Meanwhile, the economic ripple effects of this entire standoff are showing up everywhere. Brent crude, which is the global oil benchmark, has been trading somewhere in the mid-$80 range, and the International Energy Agency has been openly warning that the world is burning through its strategic oil stockpiles at a pace that is becoming increasingly hard to sustain the longer this closure drags on. Every time there's a diplomatic signal that suggests a deal might be close, prices dip. Every time there's another strike or another round of hardline rhetoric, prices spike right back up. It has become this constant whiplash cycle, and honestly, that volatility might be exactly what certain players in this story actually want. Shipping insurers, for example, have an obvious financial interest in risk staying elevated in this region because higher risk premiums mean higher insurance payouts on every single voyage that still manages to get through. It is not a conspiracy theory to point out that certain intermediaries benefit financially from prolonged instability. It is just basic economics. And it is worth keeping in mind every time you see a diplomatic actor pushing hard for a resolution that somehow always seems to stay just out of reach. There's also a quieter story developing around what's being called the Persian Gulf Strait Authority, an entity Iran effectively stood up on its own to claim legal and operational control over who gets to pass through Hormuz and under what conditions. Iran's foreign minister has claimed that traffic under the original Memorandum of Understanding actually reached around 60% of normal levels before things collapsed, and he has laid the blame for that collapse squarely on Washington, pointing to continued drone strikes and tanker attacks along the southern route near Oman as proof that the United States broke the agreement first. Now, here's an honesty check worth pausing on, because it cuts both ways. Iran genuinely does not need a massive conventional navy to keep herding shipping through that strait. It takes a couple of guys on a fast boat with maybe $20,000 worth of commercial drone equipment to make an entire tanker captain think twice about that route. That is the terrifying asymmetry of this whole situation. The United States can deploy $20 billion worth of naval hardware to that region, and Iran can still functionally disrupt global shipping with equipment that costs less than a used car. That is why this conflict is not going to be solved purely through overwhelming firepower. And it's a big part of why, even with all of that hardware in the water, transit numbers still have not returned to anywhere close to pre-war levels. Now for the rest of the global roundup, because there are a few other threads worth knowing about. Talks between Iran and Oman have reportedly made some progress on a legal mechanism for managing a new traffic route through the strait, which Iran's foreign minister has described as being very close to finalized. Qatar's foreign ministry says it is also working behind the scenes as a mediator, focused on some kind of short-term arrangement that could bring both sides back to a negotiating table, even if a full resolution is still far off. Elsewhere in the region, the Houthi movement in Yemen has continued its own campaign of attacks near the Bab el-Mandeb Strait, another critical choke point just to the south, striking government-held territory and killing dozens of troops and civilians in recent fighting. A reminder that this entire stretch of water from the Persian Gulf down through the Red Sea has become one continuous zone of maritime risk, rather than a series of isolated hotspots. On the sanctions front, the Treasury Secretary has said the administration is preparing what he called unprecedented economic measures against Iran, with more details expected to be announced in the coming days, layering financial pressure on top of the military pressure that is already squeezing Tehran's ability to move money and resources. There's also been a steady drumbeat of reporting on sanctioned tankers rerouting through unconventional paths, including reports of vessels using Arctic shipping routes, specifically to avoid detection while carrying cargo of uncertain origin, which tells you just how far some of these shadow fleet operators are willing to go to keep sanctioned oil moving despite the pressure campaign. And back on the diplomatic front, an official from the Department of War, which is the renamed version of what used to be called the Department of Defense, has been publicly sparring with news outlets over their coverage of the Lincoln situation, essentially accusing reporters of misrepresenting what life aboard the carrier actually looks like, even as families continue to speak out with a very different account. There's also a broader naval rotation story worth flagging here, because it tells you the Pentagon itself understands this deployment cannot continue indefinitely in its current form. A replacement carrier strike group has reportedly already begun making its way toward the Middle East specifically to relieve the Lincoln, which lines up with the acting Navy Secretary's statement that the ship will finally be heading home. That rotation alone tells you something important, because swapping out an entire carrier strike group in the middle of an active blockade operation is not a small logistical undertaking. It requires weeks of planning, overlapping coverage windows so there's no gap in the blockade's presence, and coordination across multiple fleets. The fact that it's happening now, in the same week as this territorial claim, suggests the military is trying to project two messages simultaneously that don't fully align with each other. We are dominant and entrenched here for the long haul, while also quietly acknowledging that the current posture has become unsustainable for the people actually carrying it out. Keep an eye on how that rotation unfolds over the coming weeks, because any delay or disruption to it would tell us a lot about how stretched American naval resources actually are in this theater after 6 straight months of combat operations. So let's get into the real strategic analysis here, because this is the part that actually matters long after the headlines fade. When the president says he is going to declare the Strait of Hormuz a territory of the United States, what does that actually mean in practice? Because if you look at this claim, honestly, there's no clear legal pathway for it whatsoever. The Strait of Hormuz is an international waterway that runs between Iran on one side and Oman on the other, and under long-standing principles of maritime law, a strait like this one is generally treated as international waters where all nations retain rights of transit passage, regardless of who controls the surrounding coastline. Iran has claimed sovereignty and control over the strait dating back to the Iranian Revolution in 1979, and no international body has ever recognized a competing American claim to the waterway itself, because, frankly, until this week, no American administration had ever seriously floated one. You cannot simply declare a body of water controlled by two other sovereign nations, Iran and Oman, to be American territory through a speech at a police academy fundraiser. There is no treaty mechanism, no congressional authorization, no United Nations pathway that gets you there. So what is actually happening here strategically? A few things, and they are worth separating out individually. First, this is domestic political messaging aimed squarely at a midterm election year audience, delivered in front of a friendly crowd, designed to project total dominance and a clean narrative of victory at a moment when public support for the war itself is actually quite shaky, with recent polling showing a solid majority of American voters opposed to continued military action against Iran. Second, it is a pressure tactic aimed directly at Tehran, an attempt to signal that the blockade is not a temporary wartime measure, but potentially a permanent fixture designed to push Iranian leadership toward the negotiating table, out of fear that the current arrangement becomes the new normal rather than something that gets rolled back once a ceasefire is signed. And third, and this is the piece a lot of casual observers miss, it functions as a message to allies and rivals alike about how far the United States is willing to go to secure control over a choke point that the entire global economy depends on, regardless of whether the legal framework actually supports that level of control. But here is the tension that nobody in either government wants to say out loud clearly. You can maintain military dominance over a body of water through ships, aircraft, and satellites without ever having legal sovereignty over it. And that is functionally what is happening right now. The blockade is real. The warships are real. The radar coverage and the strike packages are real. But calling that a territory in the legal sense is a different category of claim entirely. One that would require either Iran's total collapse and a subsequent imposed settlement, which is an extraordinarily unlikely outcome given Iran's demonstrated ability to keep disrupting shipping even after months of sustained military pressure, or some kind of negotiated arrangement that Iran would have to willingly sign on to, which seems almost impossible to imagine given the tone of Tehran's response this week. Gharibabadi's statement was not diplomatic hedging. It was a direct rejection wrapped in language clearly designed to project strength to a domestic Iranian audience that has been enduring economic devastation for months. Both governments, in other words, are performing certainty and dominance for their own domestic audiences, while the actual situation on the water remains genuinely unresolved and enormously costly for everyone caught in the middle. There's another layer worth digging into here, which is what this kind of rhetoric does to the broader international system. Plenty of countries around the world, including some of America's own allies, rely heavily on stable, predictable transit through international choke points like Hormuz for their own energy security. If the precedent gets set that a major military power can simply declare an international strait to be its own sovereign territory because it maintains naval superiority there, that is a precedent that cuts in multiple directions. And it is not hard to imagine other global powers pointing to exactly this kind of rhetoric to justify their own expansive claims over contested waterways elsewhere in the world. That is part of why you're seeing relatively muted public reactions from a lot of countries that otherwise have deep security relationships with Washington. Nobody wants to publicly endorse a framework where military presence alone can be treated as a substitute for internationally recognized sovereignty, because that framework does not stay contained to just one strait or just one conflict. Think about the other choke points scattered around the globe that operate under similar international norms. The Strait of Malacca between Indonesia and Malaysia, the Bosphorus controlled by Turkey, the Bab el-Mandeb we already touched on near Yemen, even the Panama Canal, which has already been the subject of its own separate territorial rhetoric from this same administration earlier in the year. Every one of those waterways matters enormously to regional and global trade, and every single government that controls or borders one of those choke points is watching how this Hormuz situation plays out as a potential blueprint, either as a cautionary tale about the limits of that kind of rhetoric, or, more worryingly, as a precedent they could eventually point back to if they ever want to justify expanding their own claims over waters that international law currently treats as shared. That is the quiet, longer-term stake in all of this that goes well beyond the immediate question of oil prices, or even the war with Iran itself. It touches the entire architecture of how the world has agreed to treat shared maritime space for the better part of a century. So where does this actually go from here? Realistically, the most likely near-term outcome is continued stalemate punctuated by periodic escalation. Iran does not have the conventional naval or air power to force the American blockade open, but it clearly retains enough asymmetric capability, cheap drones, fast boats, and coastal missile batteries to keep meaningful volumes of shipping from feeling safe enough to transit at anything close to normal levels. The United States, for its part, has more than enough hardware to keep enforcing its blockade on Iranian ports indefinitely from a pure capability standpoint. But the human cost of that enforcement, as we just talked about with the Lincoln, and the economic cost in terms of global oil prices, are both mounting in ways that create real pressure for some kind of negotiated off-ramp, regardless of how confident the public rhetoric sounds. The talks between Iran and Oman may eventually produce some kind of workable traffic management framework that both sides can live with, without either one having to publicly admit defeat. And that is honestly the most plausible path toward any kind of de-escalation in the near term, far more plausible than an actual American territorial claim over the strait itself, which remains, at least for now, far closer to political theater than achievable policy. What do you think happens next? Do you think this rhetoric is purely for a domestic political audience? Or do you think there's a real strategy behind eventually trying to formalize some kind of permanent American presence over this waterway? Let me know what you think down in the comments. I read every single one of them, and I'm genuinely curious how people are reading the situation differently depending on where you're watching from. If you found this breakdown useful, make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss the next update, because this story is moving fast, and there's a lot more still to unpack in the days ahead, from the outcome of these Oman talks to whatever comes out of the sanctions package the Treasury Department says is on the way. Thanks so much for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.